On behalf of His Excellency President David Granger, I welcome you to the Ministry of the Presidency and to this briefing session this morning. This will be a brief yet significant event in the history of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, where, in keeping with a promise made to the people of Guyana, the government will release for public viewing the Petroleum Agreement between the Cooperative Republic of Guyana and ExxonMobil. By way of flow, after my brief remarks, we will have remarks by the Minister of Natural Resources, the Honorable Mr. Raphael Trotman. Thereafter, after his remarks, we'll have a presentation on aspects of the agreement by Mr. Rod Henson and his team from ExxonMobil. Following that, we will distribute the contracts for all of you. Thereafter, we will disperse. Thank you very much, and I invite Minister Trotman.
Good morning, all. Excellency, Honorable Prime Minister, ministerial colleagues, friends, patriots of Guyana. Indeed, this is quite an outstanding day in the annals of our country, the history of our country that will be written about for years to come. So, as promised, and to give fulfillment to the words of Minister Harman, who a few weeks ago said that before the end of 2017, the government will release the contract that was entered into with ExxonMobil and its partners Hess and CNOOC Nexen. Hess being an American company, CNOOC Nexen, Chinese national offshore oil company, which acquired Nexen, which was a Canadian company. So those three, Mr. Henson may speak about that a little later, those three have been awarded a license by the government of Guyana to explore and develop petroleum resources in the Stabroek block. I just wish to say that when we assumed office, that is the APNU-AFC coalition in May of 2015, we did so days after there had been a significant find, as it was so described at the time by ExxonMobil as the operator. We later, in that year of 2015, went on to give definition to that significant find as it was then described, and concluded that the Liza field by itself contained a minimum of 800 million barrels of recoverable oil to a possible 1.4 billion barrels of oil. Thereafter, Exxon drilled a well known as Skipjack, which well turned up to be dry. And as anyone who is involved in mining and exploration would know, it is believed that if Skipjack had been drilled and explored first, it very well could have changed the dynamics, because Exxon may have concluded that the Stabroek was not a fruitful basin to explore. Drilling a well is an expensive business and can run to several $100 million per well. Thereafter, other wells were drilled, and we did have successive discoveries. And on each occasion, I would recall receiving the news, feeling a sense of heaviness, and then I would pass the news on to His Excellency the President that, sir, there's been another discovery. And I would hear his voice drop as well, because it was another layer of responsibility that fell on our shoulders. So we have made discoveries, Government of Guyana and Exxon, at the Payara well, at a well that is known as Snook, and a well most recently known as Turbot. Together, and I can announce, I believe it is our right to let the people of Guyana know, together the reserves that are known in those wells to date approximate to about 3.2 billion barrels of oil. That is more than many, many, many countries in the world have. And it is significant that we know that figure. We can multiply that by a multiplier of 50, which is considered the base price per barrel of crude oil today. Guyana is entitled to 50% of that, together with a 2% royalty. I say something now about the contract. When government took office, one will recall that on the 26th of May, His Excellency was inaugurated. He was sworn in, of course, previously on the 16th of May of 2015, but on the 26th of May, the government of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela issued decree number 1787, which decree redrew, in a sense, the maritime borders, or purported to withdraw the maritime borders of Venezuela, taking in with that redrawing, or that purported redrawing, the Liza field and most of the maritime zone previously known to be Guyana's. So that is how this government started its work, and it is in that context that many decisions were made against that backdrop. So government took a decision, firstly, not to have an expansive review and renegotiation of the contract with Exxon. We recognized that Exxon had made a discovery. ExxonMobil was considered one of the top two oil developing and petroleum producing companies in the world. ExxonMobil was the only company that was brave enough to venture into our waters and to explore for oil, when many others either felt afraid to do so, and many others, in fact, one particular company in particular was run out of our waters and its ship arrested and escorted elsewhere by a corvette. So we recognized that we had with us a company that, one, had made a discovery, had a binding contract with the government and people of Guyana, which had been signed in 1999, was brave and committed to developing the resource, had the capacities, financial and technical capacities to do so, and government believed that it should enter into a long-term, stable relationship with this company. We have received much advice from many sources, some of which we have dispersed, Joe, to use your term, and dispensed with, but some of it has been wholesome. And one such bit of advice was that we should, given our relative size as a nation with less than 1 million people, given our relative underdevelopment and our relative inexperience, we should try to stabilize our relationships. Rather than go out and court 15 and 20 companies to come into our waters and develop the resource, we should try to manage what we had discovered, build better relations with the company that had made a discovery, and make that a long-term objective. And to that extent, the model which Botswana used was the one that the international financial institutions recommended to us. Botswana, as we know, has made a discovery many years ago of diamonds. It chose to enter into a long-term relationship with De Beers, the diamond company, and of course there are other companies around, but it anchored itself and its national development with one company. And so it was the decision of this government that we would continue the agreement which had been entered into by the previous PVP Civic Administration, and that we would make minor modifications rather than enter into protracted long-term negotiations with the company. To that extent, we were able to raise some of the fees, and the slides that you will see will speak to some of those. We were able to introduce a 2% royalty where previously there was 0 royalty. Now, some people have said that the royalty should have been 10%, it should have been 20%. But I wish to make a few points about that. Firstly, there are different types of contracts. There is a production share or profit sharing contract, which is what we inherited in 1999. And there's also the royalty-based contract. We were already receiving 50% of the profits as an equal partner, having not sunk a single cent into the development of the block. We, however, decided that we would come up with a hybrid of that production share agreement and put a feature of a royalty on top of that. Many countries have either the production share or they have the royalty based. We decided that we would try to enjoy the best of both worlds. And were successful in convincing Exxon, even though there was no legal basis upon which a renegotiation could pursue, because there was no frustration of contract, no breach of contract. The only things that changed were a discovery and a change of government. But it was a binding, lawful contract which Exxon was entitled to enforce should we decide not to accept it. Bear in mind that countries near, quite near and far have tampered, have interfered, and in fact one country had an arbitration award against it nearby to the west of us. where it sought to acquire the assets of the very company ExxonMobil. So for strategic and other reasons, I'm saying, we chose not to enter into a full renegotiation of this contract. And so, based on our efforts and by our calculations, we can now receive on a daily basis when production commences in 2020, close to $1 million per day. So at the end of the year, Guyana will earn about $300 million, which is as a result of what some may determine to be a modest royalty rate, but it is significant because this is money that does not come from a grant or a loan or is not pursued, or the fruits rather from the pursuit from taxes. This is money that will come to us and accrue to us on a daily basis. So with that said, I'd just like to mention a few other things. One, we also determined that under no circumstances, and I thank Mr. Dennison for this as well, Commissioner of GGMC, that there will be flaring of the gas. It is common industry practice that there's flaring, and we determined that given the green approach and the commitments made by His Excellency, that Exxon would not flare the natural gas, which accompanied the find. I remember when we tested the gas, the flow, for a few days. Most people did not know this, but you had to test the rate of the pressure to determine quantum. An aircraft, I believe a Caribbean Airlines aircraft, heading to Tamari, reported a ship on fire in the seas of Guyana. It caused quite a stir between the Coast Guard and MARAD, and so we had to calm things down and say there's not a fire, it's just a flaring to test. So we've determined that we may flare for testing only, but we will not be flaring on a continuous daily 24-hour basis. Also, there has been much said about the size of the Stabroek Block, and that the government, and yours truly in particular, has given away the birthright of Guyana. For the reasons which I've stated earlier, and the strategic importance of having this company develop the resource on our behalf, we sought to maintain the exact proportions of the grant that had been given by the PPP Civic Administration in 1999. We did not take a single millimeter, neither did we add a single millimeter to what had already been given to Exxon. So the claim about us giving away the resource and losing for it, I'm amazed at. Given the fact, as I said, that we will earn the value of the resources already about $160 billion, with Guyana being entitled to half of that, it is sometimes bemusing to understand why there's this clamor for more money when in fact we should be more concerned about how are we going to manage this resource. Being less than $1 million, how are we going to protect this resource? Because there are going to be others who will want to come and share it with us, sometimes not by choice, but by force. So those are the primary concerns of the government. How do we protect what we have rather than be going out? We're entitled to 80 billion, we want now 90 billion. We're less than 1 million people. And I believe one former, it was revealed last week, one former senior official of a neighboring state was on television saying that, they're going to be like Qatar, they're going to be rich. And he was almost angry that Guyana was going to be wealthy. On a per capita basis, we're going to be that wealthy. So these are some of the considerations that led to our negotiations and discussions with Exxon. As I said, it was not a negotiation of the manner and type that we are accustomed to, where we sit and have long back and forth over every clause, but we did make some minor adjustments. In closing, I just wish to say that it is unfortunate that the opposition is not here. We did invite them in Parliament. I did say that an invitation would be extended, and we would expect that they would be present. They've chosen not to be, and I suppose that will be spoken about by them later on. But they know in the opposition, and others know, the reason why the 1999 contract was not revealed. We are being beaten up for, why aren't you revealing? But in 1999, they took a decision not to reveal contracts. It was in this very building when the then opposition sought to get more details of the Amila Falls project, that they were invited into this building, into a closed room, to see just some pages of it, not the entire document. That was never made public. So this is a signal day in the history of the country. I am grateful for the time and attention that you've given, and I will join Minister of State tomorrow at his press conference to answer any more questions that may arise. But I wanted to give the context and the background to our relationship with ExxonMobil, and I thank you very much. Thank you.
We're very happy to partner with Guyana to help develop its resources in a responsible and mutually beneficial way. I'm going to take a few minutes to help provide some context around the agreement that is being disclosed today. So following the good fortune of our discoveries on the Stabroek block, we know that there's a lot of interest in this agreement. We've stated multiple times, ExxonMobil and our partners, we support transparency, and so we're fully supportive of the government's proposal to share all the industry contracts publicly. So in my short time today, I'm going to provide some context around the negotiation that was completed in 2016, the payments and fees that were agreed to, and an estimate of the revenues that will be generated for the people of Guyana. Then I'll discuss a few of the key articles of the Stabroek Agreement. But first, I want to take special note of a few high-level key points. One is that the 2016 Stabroek New Agreement is based on Guyana's 2012 model agreement with limited changes. So largely, we just updated the old agreement to the more modern terms and the language that was preferred by the government. Both parties could have lived with the existing agreement that was in place, as Minister Trotman mentioned, but it was evident that reworking the agreement provided additional benefits to both parties, and it secured a range of additional benefits to Guyana for work commitments, training, local content, and increased fees and payments. Next, the petroleum agreement is globally competitive for countries at similar stages of exploration. Yes, we had discovered the Liza field, but we had not fully appraised its size. This was only one field. It did not have proven production, and we also had the skipjack dry hole in addition to other companies' history of unsuccessful exploration. It's unreasonable to compare this agreement to those achieved in more mature oil and gas countries like Brazil, mature countries in West Africa, the United States, or Canada. And it's even more unreasonable to cherry-pick single elements of an agreement and do so. One must always look at the entirety of the agreement and the conditions at the time the agreement was executed. But let's talk about the long-term benefits that are born out of this agreement. Naturally, people want to get a sense for the numbers and the revenue. And I'll show a chart on this very shortly. But if you make a couple of assumptions, if you take IMF's crude price forecast, which starts around $50 a barrel, then this Liza Phase 1 project, just the first 5 years, could yield over $1.5 billion to Guyana. And over the life of the project, some 20 years, will yield over $7 billion. Everything I talk about today is going to be in US dollars, by the way, but this conversion of potential into real revenue can substantially increase the standard of living in Guyana. So the 2016 Petroleum Agreement replaced our existing agreement, and it provided ExxonMobil and our partners with a 10-year exploration term through 2026. It's divided into 3 periods, as you see in this graphic: an initial 4-year period, followed by 2 3-year renewal periods. Now, the context of that discussion that occurred was that in early 2015, as we know, the Liza the Liza 1 discovery was made. Very exciting news, but that in itself did not require us to make a new agreement. There was already an existing petroleum agreement that was valid through the middle of 2018. We could have carried on with our exploration program through that time and sought a production license for Liza and any other discoveries to be developed later. However, after the discovery, it was apparent that there was value to both Guyana, and ourselves to look for this formal extension. Now, for background, since '99, when ours was originally signed, the government had updated their model contract for all future petroleum agreements. It was posted on GGMC's website for a long time, and it's commonly referred to as the 2012 model agreement. So Guyana could move from the old 1999 petroleum agreement to the newer, modern 2012 model agreement. This new agreement provided for additional revenue streams and captured new exploration commitments, as well as greater commitments for the development of Guyanese people and resources. Now, to the benefit of both of us was time, gave us more time. More time allowed us to put early focus on appraising the Liza-1 discovery, rather than concentrating solely on continuous exploration before the existing agreement would have expired in 2018. Early appraisal of Liza has allowed us to bring revenues to Guyana earlier. This also provided more time for the evaluation of the 3D seismic and other study work so we could optimize our exploration program. An optimized program is what we all want. We all want to try to minimize unsuccessful wells. So with that background, let's look a little closer at some of the new payments that arise from the new agreement. We agreed to a number of higher or new payments in return for time. Firstly, there was an $18 million signature bonus when this agreement was executed. As part of the agreement as Article 33, which you'll see later. There were annual rental fees that had been at $240,000 were substantially increased to $1 million every year for the life of the agreement. Likewise, the annual payment to the government for training and capacity building of Guyanese personnel was increased to $300,000 per year from $45,000. Also, a new commitment was entered into whereby we'll annually fund $300,000 for social and environmental programs around Guyana. Now, we actually have done, many of you know, and we'll continue to do much more than that, but now this is a minimum commitment that is written as part of the contract. And then, widely known, we agreed to a 2% royalty. This royalty increases the government's early revenue and overall government take. So coupled with additional work commitments, there's a wide-ranging increase in the long-term annual fees, in addition to the benefit of converting an old contract into the government's preferred language of the 2012 model agreement. Now, when we talk about long-term benefits and as the contract goes public, it's important not to lose sight of the fact that the Liza Phase 1 production is the big value driver at this time. So we're going to look at that now. This next chart is it's a key chart to understand some of the basic principles of the agreement, as well as a revenue split between the investors and the government. So, if I may, you have years across the bottom of the chart, 2015 to 2040. Along the y-axis, you've got annual cash flow in billions of US dollars. So this is for Liza Phase 1 only. And so in 2016, we expect the co-venturers will spend this much. In 17, we expect we'll spend this much, all to get the Liza Phase 1 on production. So under the type of agreement chosen by Guyana, we spend all the money, take the risk, bring the technology, et cetera, so that in 2020, first oil production and therefore revenues begin to flow, shown as the bars above zero. Now the gray bars, these represent recovery of those costs, all these costs that have been borne. Gray bars represent the cost recovery without profit and capped at 75% of production each year. So that gray bar goes up to 75%. You'll see that after just a few years, we catch up, and the amount of oil used for cost recovery is expected to significantly drop. So after that point, we're essentially just recovering the annual operating cost of the field. Now, above the gray bars, the remaining represents the split of profit oil with the government's profit oil and revenue shown by the green bars, which are slightly larger than the yellow bars, which represent the investor's profit. Now again, it just represents the basic principle that the investors get to recover their cost and then we split the profits 50-50. And Guyana gets revenue from day one. Now this is just Liza Phase 1 only, and I'll repeat as I said earlier, if you make some assumptions, if you take a public IMF's crude forecast for price, starts out around $50 a barrel. After 5 years, Guyana reaps between $1.5 and $2 billion. Over the life of the Phase 1 project only, it delivers to Guyana over $7 billion. Now, the lawyers caution me that I have to say this isn't a guarantee, right? There are assumptions for production forecasts, for price, future cost, and everything else, but you do get the picture. This is our transparent view. This is what we think this is going to look like. Now on to the contract. So it was fully executed and became effective October 7, 2016. Reviewing the agreement, you'll see that it's largely Guyana's 2012 model agreement with limited amendments. So the vast majority of its contents are very familiar to anyone who's looked at that 2012 agreement. Now, I'm going to highlight a number of key articles in the contract. In the interest of time, of course, I'm not going to read the whole thing or cover every single article, but we're going to talk about many that we think would be of most interest. It's important to note that what I'm going to do is just quickly summarize these things. I'm not here to argue strict legal interpretations. Everybody will be able to read the contract after today, and luckily it's very straightforward. So let's start with Article 4 of the contract. This explains the term or the periods that were agreed to. As we've said, it's an initial 4-year period to 2020, then 2 3-year renewal periods. Now these periods come with new exploration minimum work commitments, essentially 1 well per period with additional seismic interpretation. Article 5 outlines how we need to relinquish 20% of the contract area at the end of the first renewal period. There are a few exceptions to this in the contract, largely based around the discovery areas that we've already achieved. And then the remaining area, the rest of the block, essentially needs to be relinquished at the end of the second renewal period, at which time Guyana can then seek to release it out to someone else. That's how these work. Long-term view. Guyana's in this for decades and decades. Article 6 is where the role of the minister or the delegate is explained in detail, things like reviewing our exploration work program, our budget, development plans. It explains audit rights, and those types of things are in Article 6, which you'll see. Article 8, it's explained how we progress from an offshore discovery to a 20-year production license, which has a single 10-year extension option at the end. Article 10 contains the $1 million annual rental charge that was agreed to. You might equate this to essentially like an annual lease payment for the acreage. So Article 11 is cost recovery and production sharing, and together with Annex C, which is the accounting procedures, those may be of interest. As we've talked about, the contractor can recover their investment costs without profit. Here's where you'll find a 75% cap on the total monthly production that can be used for cost recovery to ensure that there's revenues from day one. And there are detailed accounting procedures that describe the government's audit rights and outlining that it has full access to relevant records, invoices, and whatnot in order to conduct those audits. It also explicitly lists what is and what is not cost recoverable. All of this is essentially the same as the 2012 Guyana model contract. After cost recovery, the article outlines how the split of the remaining profit volumes are split 50-50 between the government and the co-venturers, the investors. Now, there's already been some discussion about natural gas, and Article 12 talks about its treatment. As is the global norm, gas use is prioritized for oil field operations, and that will be the case for Liza Field 1, because that essentially helps us recover more oil. The contract provides a 5-year period to conduct a feasibility study for the utilization of gas, and this reflects the complexity of gas commercialization. Gas is tougher than oil, essentially. Gas requires significant infrastructure and market development. Now, but as you've heard, one study underway is for Liza Phase 1 gas is a gas-to-power project that's being looked at right now. Early stages, but that's one area that's being looked at. Article 14 describes the options that the government has for the sale of Guyana's profit oil volumes. The government can market those themselves or ask that the contractor market the government's crude, and it can change the selection with 6 months' notice. This marketing option to allow the contractor to market is often chosen in countries that haven't done this before as a period of learning, and then they change after a few years. They take over that responsibility themselves. It's totally the government's option. If we do the marketing, a process would be agreed to negotiate, the fees that are competitive, fair, and transparent. Article 15, you'll see, together with Article 21, outlines the tax arrangements of the Petroleum Agreement. These arrangements, like most of the contract, are the same as what was in the 2012 model agreement, apart from the inclusion here of a new 2% royalty. Now, certain tax exemptions are listed. These exemptions are a very common feature of the oil industry where, one, governments choose to structure the agreements such that they get most of the value from profit oil versus the full tax burden, or two, where the maturity of the oil industry in that country drives the need to incentivize more investment. Other taxes do remain payable, such as withholding and employee taxes, which will generate multiple millions of dollars of revenue. Article 17 places a domestic market obligation on the contractors, on the partners here, and this is one that often generates questions. So what does this mean? This would oblige the contractors to supply oil or gas to the domestic, that's important, not export, but to the domestic market if the total government entitlement was insufficient. Now, this could come into play at some point in the future. It's unlikely to come into play early, as the domestic need in Guyana currently is relatively low. It's a pretty standard article, though. Regardless, I'll point out that ExxonMobil and our partners are always open to exploring sales to any competitive buyer. So the next slide is the last slide, and this is where we'll start with Article 18. And here's where you'll find very clear local content obligations that are placed on us by the contract, including a criteria to preference Guyanese. The contract supplements this with a detailed review, reporting, and stewardship process with the government. We're required to have a very detailed local content plan, which we've submitted. The establishment of our Center for Local Business Development, which I know many of you have seen and been to over on South Road, is part of our plan and part of how we're meeting this commitment. And we're already working very hard to award work to a growing number of competitive Guyanese businesses. I'm very proud that at EEPGL, we already have over a 70% Guyanese workforce, with many in leadership positions. And overall, for all the work that we're doing, working with our contractors, we're already over 50% Guyanese workforce. And it's important to us that people are aware of these contractual obligations and our existing reporting processes as local content policy framework discussions continue. Article 19 is similar, and it just captures the now increased $300,000 annual obligation to the government for the training of Guyanese. Article 28 covers social responsibility and protection of the environment. It's here that clear obligations exist concerning prevention of, and if necessary, remediation of potential environmental impacts from Stabroek operations. It's important to note that these are just in addition to existing applicable laws and regulations. Now, this article contains a new commitment to fund $300,000 annually for the environment and social projects around Guyana. And lastly, we have Article 33. Here's the language around the $18 million signature bonus that was agreed to, not to gain access to the Starbrook block because we had that, but it was to gain this extension. And so I'll just put up the summary slide again and make a couple of closing comments. Hopefully this has been helpful to summarize the agreement. I realize perhaps not all questions are going to be answered through this presentation, but all will have an opportunity to read the full agreement, and hopefully all the industry agreements in order to have a broader context. In closing, I thank you for the opportunity to speak. Guyana is an important country for ExxonMobil and our partners. We hold dear this opportunity, but we also recognize the responsibility that's involved in this partnership. We'll meet our commitments under this agreement, and we look forward to seeing the long-term benefits that our mutual work will bring to Guyana. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rod, for that presentation on the contract and some selected terms of the contract. And what we will do now, we will release the contract on CD. So each one of you will have a copy of the contract. Additionally, as we release them on CD to you, the contracts will be up on the web. In fact, you can see them at yeah, okay. Yes, thank you. www.dpi.gov.gy/contract. So as you're receiving it there now, it's on the World Wide Web, so you can see this all there. So you have nothing to hide. And as you receive this, I trust that much of the speculation which was going on, that we'll have now informed comment based on the authentic contract which you have seen. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.